You have probably heard of fiction, the branch of literary with made-up stories and characters. What you may not know is that not all fiction is considered literary. So now let us define what is literary fiction. So literary fiction is defined as symbolic or thematic fiction considered to have literary merit through the incorporation of themes that reveals human truths. In other words, it is a story that tries to be bigger than the story itself. To do this, literary fiction must comment on something that is considered significant, such as the social or political issues or the human condition. So literary fiction can be described as layered with inner stories and subtext. Its characters tend to be complex because the literary fiction examines characters' motivations and thoughts in order to get the readers emotionally invested. For this reason, the pacing tends to be slow as to make room for such character development. So literary fiction is the ability to create memorable characters. So the writing style of literary fiction is typically elegant, with language that is elevated or poetic, as it focuses more on discovery in truths rather than entertaining readers or solving problems, and its tone is usually serious because the truths literary fiction grapples with try to get readers thinking about universal issues like fate, human tragedy, and purpose. To further understand, guys, I have here some differences between literary fiction and genre fiction. So here is the literary fiction versus genre fiction. Critics of literary fiction usually contrast into the genre fiction, or fiction that is written to be popular to a mass audience. The main differences between literary fiction and genre fiction is their reliance on plot. While genre fiction is driven by plot, literary fiction is less about its plot and more about the value of its commentary. A great way to look at the distinction is to remember that genre fiction tries to help you to escape reality, while literary fiction tries to get you to open up to your reality. So next, what are the characteristics of literary fiction? First, literary fiction doesn't follow a formula. Unlike genre fiction, which follows a loose but predictable narrative, literary fiction doesn't adhere to any rules. So anything can happen, which can be both exciting and unnerving for the reader. Sometimes literary fiction takes a common theme in genre fiction and turns it on its head. For example, the idea of a good overcoming evil and challenge in George Orwell's 1984. Next, number 2, literary fiction uses creative storytelling, free from rules. The literary fiction writer is able to push the boundary of what's acceptable, and sometimes the results are extraordinary. Because literary fiction isn't bound to the strict standards of a specific subgenre, every author is free to make up their own rules as they go along. The reader is never quite sure where the adventure will take them. Number 3 is literary fiction explores the human condition, while genre fiction as a whole seeks to distract the reader through light entertainment. Literary fiction is much more introspective in its objective. Literary fiction as a whole wants to make sense of the world around us by exploring the human condition. An example of this is Rohinton, Mistress, A Fine Balance, which is a hunting tale of India in 1970s and 1980s. So number 4 is literary fiction may be difficult to read. Literary fiction may rely on symbolism or allegory to convey a deeper meaning. There's almost always a deeper takeaway than the story itself reveals. So number 5, literary fiction is character focused. The character must be explored and defined, and the impetus that moves the story forward. Literary fiction doesn't just show the character in action, it also shows how every action changes the character. Number 6 is literary fiction often has an ambiguous ending. In literary fiction, endings are usually sad, abrupt, or left up to your interpretation. Sometimes nothing is resolved, which leaves the reader desperate to find meaning in it all. And the last is number 7. Literary fiction is award friendly. It often pushes boundaries and employs a unique perspective, work of literary fiction get more awards. So, guys, to sum it up, literary fiction provides a fresh way to tell stories and it ignores standard formula. Now, let us proceed to Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the author of 100 Years of Solitude. He is an American Spanish and a Colombian novelist, short story writer, screenwriter, and journalist, known affectionately as Gabu or Gabito throughout Latin America. Considered as one of the most significant authors of the 20th century, particularly in the Spanish language. He was awarded as the 1972 Neustadt International Prize for Literature and the 1982 Nobel Prize in Literature. And he is best known for his novels 100 Years of Solitude during 1967, Chronicle of Death Foretold during 1981, and Love in the Time of Cholera during 1985. His works have achieved significant critical acclaim and widespread commercial success, most notably for popularizing a literary style known as magic realism. His novels were filled with miraculous and enchanting events and characters, love and madness, wars, politics, dreams, and death. Then, the biggest and most obvious theme of 100 Years of Solitude is that the memory and the past. The characters in the story are haunted by past decisions, and several times over the course of the novel, the past events overwhelm the present. And in addition, the themes of this novel trickle like a waterfall through 100 Years of Solitude, returning again and again to illuminate the Buendias family and human nature. They are time, fate, humor, and magic. The novel takes place in the fictional and fantastical town of Macondo. Macondo serves as a setting as well as a metaphor to Colombia itself. In the narrative of 100 Years of Solitude, the town grows from a tiny settlement and almost no contact with the outside world, to eventually become a large and thriving place before a banana plantation is set up. 100 Years of Solitude tells the story of fictional Colombian town Macondo and the rise and fall of its founders, the Buendia family, revealed through undergoing temporal folds, character inherit, the names and disposition of their family, unfolding patterns and the double and record. That would be all. Thank you.